Hello.
Is it working? No. Hello.
Est-ce que ça fonctionne?
Hello. Oh, okay. I think it's problem. Ready? Okay. Hello. I hope everyone can hear me well. Welcome to this discussion today. It's a pleasure to moderate it. My name is Anna Beitene. I'm from University of Tartu. I'm a project manager. And today we have truly a very international panel, which is entitled Identifying and Countering Disinformation, Lessons Learned from France and Estonia. And it is my pleasure to introduce my colleagues, maybe just a small technical detail. Most of our panel will be in English, but all of you also have a live translation. A couple of interventions will be in French. But now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our colleagues. So first we have, and I will do my best to pronounce French surnames, but you have to be patient with me. So first we have here Cécile Bollier-Bandier, exactly, and senior lecturer and researcher at the Center for Research on Risks and Vulnerabilities at the University of Caen, Normandy. We have Virginie Bonnieux, senior lecturer in social psychology at the Faculty of Psychology, also at University of Caen, Normandy. Then we have Stefano Braghiroli, associate professor of European Studies at Johann Schutte Institute of Political Studies, University of Tartu. And last but not least, Maili Wilson, who is Deputy Head of Academic Affairs at Johann Schutte Institute of Political Studies at the University of Tartu. So I think our speakers deserve a small round of applause. Thank you. All right. So I will very briefly, also I will try not to forget about the slides, so trying to multitask here. So I think that you can see the slides on the other side. So we have already a round of introductions here. So very briefly, I will mention how our panel is going to be structured. I will try to keep an eye on the timing. In general, we have quite some time for the discussion. And first of all, we will start with a very brief introduction of what is disinformation and misinformation. And Cécile will give us a brief kind of intervention on this topic. Then we're going to talk what are the main tools, how you can identify disinformation, and Virginie will cover this subject. And in the second part of our panel, we are going to talk about practical case studies, mostly from Estonia. And in this case, both Stefano and Maili are going to share with us quite interesting data and information. Just one small detail or disclaimer, we're organizing our panel discussion today as part of a project that was funded by NATO's Public Diplomacy Division, which is entitled France and Estonia Together Against Disinformation, or FREE-TAD. And the main aim of this project, of this international collaboration, between University of Tartu and also French universities such as Catholic University of Lille and University of Bordeaux and University of Caen Normandy, as well as Normandy for Peace, was to kind of collect best practices, identify how disinformation can be identified, and it included also a various set of activities. One of them was student-led presentations, and we have quite a unique opportunity today because we also have our students with us. So they will share with you very briefly what they managed to find out at the end of our intervention. The second activity was to present and share results here today at this forum. And finally, we will have a fact-finding mission of French experts to Estonia in October to kind of draft policy recommendation and do the scenario planning in regard to that. So now, with all these organizational details now over, let's move on to our panel discussion, and just to kind of stretch legs a little bit and get into the topic. As you know, now, of course, the topic of misinformation and disinformation is very relevant. And we're surrounded by false news quite frequently, unfortunately. And I just want to share with you these 3 examples. I don't know how well you can see them from the slides, but just very briefly, have a look. And there are 3 cases over here, mostly related, well, all of them are related to France. And can you just raise your hand and tell me how many of these news do you think, at least one news is fake one? So how many of you think that one news out of these 3 is fake? Okay. How many of you think at least 2 are fake? Don't be shy. Yes. Okay. How many of you think all of them are fake? Okay, good. So then that's, well, I don't want to say good, but in a way, we're going to unpack this topic. In fact, all of these news are fake. But the degree of, let's say, fakeness or misinformation or disinformation in some extent is quite varying. So in the first one, you see a clone of the news outlet, of the Belgian one, that use a different domain, but it represented as a credible news story, which says that Macron's campaign was financed by Saudi Arabia. So this is not true, and it was also, in fact, also shared by the niece of Marie Le Pen and had around 10,000 retweets on X or Twitter. Another map is actually, it's not representing the correct information. At the time of sharing, this information was already outdated. So this was kind of showing the current tension in France, which actually was an outdated reference to 2005 unrest. And the final one is also not true because, well, there have been debates and some politicians proposed this proposal, but in fact, it's also not true. So I think that this is a good starting point to unpack the definitions of what is misinformation and disinformation, how we can be more literate in identifying this information, and what are the examples that we can learn from. So with this in mind, I want to give the floor to Cécile, and she will deliver her presentation in French. And then we will move on. Each speaker will have up to 10 minutes, so I will try to point to the time. And I will also ask you a very brief kind of question to which we can come back at the end. Okay, so then you will already start thinking. So please, Cécile, the floor is yours.
Merci, Anna.
Thank you, Anna. Hello, everyone. So now my presentation will be focusing on disinformation and misinformation. For a few decades now, on a daily basis, we have been impacted by the technology, by digital news, Instagram, X. We're talking about social media here, but this has been impacted also by the development of AI. So what has impacted? This has impacted the way that individuals and the way we interact one with another. It also is also impacting the way we communicate with one another, and that's the topic of today, and it also impacts the way that we inform ourselves. Therefore, we are in an informational context with information disorder. So information disorder is actually, as you can see, you receive a mass of information via social media, via TV, radio, etc. And there is also a circulation of fake news, as Anna was mentioning, and the term we use in France, that we use the most, is infox or fake news. We use that a lot, fake news, infox. And then we also have an information warfare that would seek to accelerate the breakdown of democratic societies. And that is really the topic of this forum, remember, and keep this in mind. Now, in this context, in this informative context, which is disturbing and disturbed, as citizens, as students, as universities, as academics, as researchers, this disinformation and misinformation which intertwine and shock or intershock, and they often are confused. We tend to confuse misinformation and disinformation. So what we will try to do during my presentation is to try to define and understand. Anna has already shown us an overview, but we will try to understand what misinformation means and what disinformation means. Let's start with misinformation. Misinformation simply is a fact that you will broadcast or you will broadcast or share a fake news, a false information without a desire to harm. You will take an information. Just give you an example. You are at high school. I'm sure you probably have a WhatsApp group beside the official information that you have by your teachers. In this WhatsApp group, you may say, Friday, 27th of September, Mrs. Teacher so-and-so is not going to be here. The teacher won't be here. The course is cancelled. This is a false information. And you will share that you don't intend to harm, but the thing is you will not come to class and you will share a false information, a fake information, but you were not trying to harm anyone. So I mentioned WhatsApp because this is a communication tool that is highly used by students in France. I'm sure the same goes for Estonia with students. So social media or social networks such as X, Instagram will simply amplify this phenomenon of misinformation rather. Misinformation, it's an information which you will share without first checking the fact. You do it quickly in a context of rapidity. This is an information which is not true. Now let's talk about disinformation. This is something else altogether. We are working on this free tag project of NATO. It's important to give you the information or definition of disinformation from NATO. Disinformation is creating and deliberately sharing false information which have been rigged or falsified in a purpose to manipulate. So we build a falsified information in order to manipulate and to lead someone in error. There is a desire to harm. You see the difference here between misinformation and disinformation. So this disinformation, this term, includes various procedures, and this is, I quote from NATO because this is echoing this forum, hostile activities of information, of disinformation. This is what it means. As you can see here, the goal is to harm. So the ultimate goal of maneuvers of disinformation is to divide society, to observe society. If you observe a society, we've had elections lately in France. If you look at what happened with the American election, we can talk about the war in Ukraine, many examples. If you look around, if you observe what's going on, and you will see that this is what is going on currently. So people are trying to divide society, to divide democratic societies, and I quote NATO once again. This is a very important information to reign, to rule, divide society on the information battlefield in order to rule better. There is a goal to harm, to divide, and the words used by NATO when it comes to warfare is really important. So which means are used in order to disseminate information and to produce disinformation? So first of all, we make up false content. I mentioned AI. The reason I mentioned that was for a purpose. We use deepfakes. We produce videos. I'm sure you have seen videos with the Pope wearing a parka, or Donald Trump with demonstrations, or Trump, etc. So people make up video contents in order to harm others. We also disseminate unfounded rumors, one in particular that went around the world. This is something that was disseminated by a very famous influencer in the US. I can't remember her name, famous influencer from the far right, close to Donald Trump. She travels with him, and she started to raise to cause issues, to cause problems, and she disseminated on a YouTube channel an information to say that the people from Haiti, the community from Haiti, I think you are familiar with this disinformation. She was she was reporting that people were eating cats, pets, dogs and cats. So what did Donald Trump do during this campaign? He disseminated the same information during a debate. This is an unfounded, unproven rumor. There's a map that you saw earlier on, a map of disinformation. But what kind of violence? Are these sexual violence, domestic violence, delinquents violence? So people disinform facts. Sometimes there are facts of violence, but this is totally out of context, and the context is very important. Sometimes in disinformation you have no space context or root context. So this disorder, this information disorder, is a very important challenge. You must be informed, not just from school, from primary school. You must be informed as to what is their source, what is misinformation, what is disinformation. This is extremely important. You must also be formed to a critical spirit to debate, also to be able to fight, to attack, to combat, because we are still in the range of a warfare. So what I just did is important. We must first identify and define, give definition of what is misinformation and disinformation, and we need to have a critical mindset. And now I give the floor to Virginie Bagneux, who will talk about that.
Maybe, thank you so much, Cécile, and I will give the floor immediately now to Virginie. But maybe I propose that I already briefly summarize a question that you can think about, so you have time, to each of the speakers, so we have time later to discuss it. So I just wanted to say thank you to Cécile for this overview about the definitions, and maybe if at the end of the panel you could also briefly elaborate about the dangers and implications of why it's so important to distinguish precisely misinformation from disinformation, and how it's important and what kind of implications are there. But now, please, Virginie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anne. In French or in English, as you prefer? French?
We have many French students.
Okay. T'as la télécommande? Merci. Alors, Cécile vous a parlé de
Cécile mentioned
a
strange word. Do you know this word? Zététique.
Personne.
Does anyone know this word, zététique? Now, zététique is a kind of toolbox which is transdisciplinary, that lists all the various tools in order to distinguish a real information from an infox, fake news. The ethics comes from skepticism. In England, we call it skepticism instead of this ethics. And in the 80s, Henri Brock is the one who used this term to refer to what he called the art of doubt. This is what we are talking about here. When you are facing an information, the challenge is to determine whether or not you can trust this information in order to share it or make a decision from that information. This is the same principle of a mental principle on which I'm working, which is necessary, and this is what we call the critical thinking, critical mindset, or the critical mindset in French, as we call it. Now, critical thinking is a capacity, is a high capacity in experimental psychology, and it is studied as being a capacity to assess the information from an epistemic point of view, meaning that we put aside our own judgment in order to identify which arguments can help us identify whether or not this information is likely, most likely, or true and real, if we can say that truth is accessible. Now, the goal of critical thinking from a deliberate examination of this information to determine whether or not I can trust this information. And therefore, I could have different results. Either I consider that this information is not credible, therefore I will not trust it, or I consider that this information is reliable, and therefore I will trust it. And in between, you have a whole range of possibilities where doubt is allowed.
Alors, pour justement essayer de
Now, in order to calibrate this level of trust of the information, let's look at two tools which we are using in the ethics. The first one is the likelihood cursor. This is a small bar representing a continuum on which you have a cursor, a slider, which you can modulate from left to right, going from absolutely probable until all the way to not at all likely. And in between, having this cursor in mind, you are able to determine whether or not there is a need for a proof, for evidence, and what kind of evidence you might need. Just give you an example here. Imagine your friend comes home from the weekend and said, okay, during the weekend, I saw a green serpent. Okay, a green serpent is quite common, especially if you look at animal documentaries, if you go to a zoo. So your cursor of likelihood will go towards the side of absolutely or most likely that what my friend just told me is true. Now imagine a second case, a second example. I saw such a big tree trunk, so big that even a car can go through it. If you put it that way, it might seem a bit extraordinary. If you look around, trees are not that size, or not to the point of having a car going through. So the cursor of likelihood of the slider would be moved towards the left, meaning not likely or most unlikely, unless you know that in California, in a number of parks, natural parks, you have this tunnel, which is very famous around the world, through which cars can go drive. Third and last example, the most extreme, aliens exist in a form of green men, green little men. Now, from our own experience, from what we know, it doesn't seem likely, therefore my slider will be moved towards the absolutely not likely side, which doesn't mean it is not at all, but at least there is a doubt here that is very much allowed. Now, this likelihood slider is not just there to determine whether an information is likely or not likely, but also to determine the kind of evidence and proofs you might need in order to make a decision regarding this information, to say I trust this information or I don't trust this information. This is what Carl Sagan is explaining in this way. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence in the same way.
Si vous considérez que
Now,
l'information
if
qui
you
vous parvient
consider
n'est pas
that the information
probable,
which you received is
et
not
qu'il faut des
likely
arguments,
and
des
that you need
preuves pour vous
arguments, you
convaincre,
need,
eh bien,
you
ce
need
deuxième outil va
evidence,
sans doute vous être
therefore the
utile. C'est ce
second
qu'on
tool
appelle
will be
l'échelle
really
des
useful.
niveaux
This is
de
what we
preuve,
call the scale of levels of
qui
evidence,
classifie en fait
which
par ordre
classifies
degré de
in
certitude,
order of
si une
certainty or
information
degrees,
provenant d'une
if
source peut être
an
considérée
information
comme
can be
fiable ou non.
considered as
Alors, tout en
reliable
bas,
or not. So
et
right
s'il y a
at the
qu'une seule
bottom,
chose que vous devez
and if
retenir
there
de
is
ces
just one
séminaires,
thing which
c'est
you
bien
must
cela.
remember from
C'est
this
que
seminar, this
un
is it.
témoignage
A
n'est pas
testimonial
une preuve.
is not an evidence. Never.
Ça n'est
A
jamais.
testimony is not a proof. It
Pourquoi?
can never
Parce qu'en
be.
fait, vous
Why?
n'étiez pas là au
Because
moment où
you were
l'événement
not
s'est
there
passé,
when the event
il
took
n'y a donc
place.
pas possibilité
Therefore,
de
there is no
vérifier
way to
si ce
verify
témoignage
whether or
Alors,
not
ça
this
veut pas dire qu'il est
testimony
faux pour
is
autant.
true or
Mais en
not.
tout
It
cas,
doesn't mean that it is
par
false.
prudence,
However,
en premier lieu,
out
on
of
considère
caution,
que ce n'est,
it is best
pas
to
une
consider
preuve
that it is
suffisante.
not sufficient
Au-dessus,
evidence.
vous avez ce qu'on
Now,
appelle
on
la
top
parole
of
d'un
that, we
expert.
have what
Là
we call
aussi,
the
un expert
word of
tout
an
seul,
expert.
isolé, c'est un
An
témoignage,
isolated
et donc, à
expert
lui
is a
seul, n'est pas
testimony,
une preuve
and therefore,
convaincante.
on his own, is
Je ne
not
vais
a
pas revenir sur
sufficient
l'exemple du Dr
evidence.
Raoult
I'm
pendant
not going
la
to
pandémie
come
du
back
Covid.
to the example of Dr. Raoult during the
C'est un bon
COVID
exemple.
pandemic, but that's an
Ensuite,
example.
alors, comment fait-on?
Now,
Eh bien,
what do we do?
par exemple, si on prend les
For
études
example,
scientifiques,
if we look at scientific
notamment
studies,
exploratoires, analytiques,
especially
on commence
experimental
déjà à
studies
rentrer
and
dans un niveau de preuve
exploration
assez
studies,
raisonnable,
we come to a level
mais
of
qui,
proof
lui,
or
non plus,
evidence
n'est
that
pas
is more
suffisant à
reasonable,
lui
but
seul.
yet
Il
not
faut, en
sufficient
plus, des études
on its own.
expérimentales
You also
qui
require
répliquent le
experimental
phénomène, qui
studies
l'expliquent,
and
qui
replication
permettent
that
de le
could
modéliser
explain
selon
the
différents
phenomena,
facteurs.
that
Et
could
donc, plus
moderate
ça va, plus
the
on
phenomenon
accumule,
with the
finalement,
various
une
factors. So
série
the
de
more it
preuves.
goes, the
Et
more
tout
you
en
can
haut, en fait,
accumulate
de cette
a
échelle
number
de
of
preuves,
pieces of
on a ce qu'on
evidence.
appelle le
And right
consensus
at the top,
scientifique.
you have what we
Alors,
call
au sens
scientific
très large du
consensus
terme, c'est
in
pas
a broad
que,
sense.
les biologistes,
It's
les
not just
physiciens,
biologists or
voire les
scientists or
psychologues.
psychologists,
C'est aussi
but also
la
englobes
pensée majoritaire
the
qu'on va
majority
considérer
of
être
the
désormais une
thinking or
connaissance.
something
C'est-à-dire
that we would
qu'il y a
consider as
tellement de gens
knowledge,
qui
meaning there are so many
l'ont
people
démontré
who have
que,
demonstrated this,
on n'a pas
proved this.
réussi à
Therefore,
montrer
we
le
have
contraire,
not
que,
been
ben,
able to
finalement,
prove the opposite. So
ce qui était une
therefore,
preuve devient
what
finalement
was
une
in
connaissance.
evidence becomes
Et à partir de là, ben, si
a
on a cette
knowledge.
connaissance,
And then
les
if you have
preuves
this knowledge,
sont plus
the
facilement
evidence is much
sont plus
easier
faciles à retrouver.
to
Donc
find.
pour conclure,
So as a
eh bien,
conclusion,
face à une information,
when you have
je
an
suspends mon
information,
jugement.
I would just put
Je
aside my own judgment,
détermine quel est le
suspend
niveau
my
de confiance que
judgment,
je peux avoir dans
determine
cette
what is the
information.
level
Et
of
si je n'ai
trust I
pas
can have in this
suffisamment d'éléments pour
information.
le décider sur
And if I
l'instant,
don't have enough
eh
pieces
bien,
of
je me
information
renseigne
or
et
evidence,
je
then I
cherche
find
des
out, I
arguments
do
qui
look
ont
for
une preuve
arguments that would have
suffisante pour me
sufficient evidence in order to convince me.
Thank you, Virginie, for this summary. I think these two tools are very practical and easy to use. And I just have one question that we can come back later on. I really liked in your presentation the metaphor that you used, the art of doubt. So how can we really develop this art of doubt, especially nowadays with the rise of AI and widespread fake news? So maybe this is something that we could also elaborate, whether these AI tools that are out there, could they be more helpers or disruption in combating disinformation? So thank you so much. Then I'll give the floor to Stefano.
Yes, thank you so much. And again, hi everyone, also on my behalf, bonjour. Miley and I will bring you more to the Estonian context, but before that, I just want to give you two additional ingredients that have to do with disinformation. One is about, let's say, the age of disinformation. Somehow we tend to think of disinformation as something relatively new. In fact, disinformation is very much as old as civilization. I give you just one example. If you look at this beautiful picture, this sculpture, it tells us a story. The only thing is that the story tells us is really not a real one. Now, I tell you myself a story. So 3,000 years ago, a pharaoh called Ramesses went to war against the Hittite Empire. The two armies basically met in a place called Kadesh. It's basically a locality between Syria and Lebanon, nowadays Syria and Lebanon. And they went to war. Let me put it this way. For Ramesses, the war didn't end up too well. Ramesses barely escaped death. But when Ramesses returned from war, he developed this beautiful sculpture. Now, let me tell you that Ramesses is the guy there that beats the Hittites. You can see it there. basically is taking revenge over the enemy and definitely claims victory. No debunker at the time challenged Ramesses' victory. And in a way, I think that since then, pretty much every person in a position of power, every ruler, has in a way or another engaged in some sort of, let's say, disinformation, and every challenger has used disinformation in order somehow to challenge that position. And very often, the tools and the objects of that disinformation were first subjects and then citizens as civilization moved on. Now, the other context that I would like to touch before bringing you to Estonia is how disinformation is particularly dangerous for democracy. Cecile already told us something about that. And she told us that, in a way, one of the goals of disinformation really to create divisions among citizens. Not think of each other as fellows that might have different ideas, but thinking of each other as in a sort of enemy logic. Fields that cannot talk to each other. That's the first goal of disinformation. And that's why it's so poisonful to democracy, because in a democracy, citizens talk to each other. In a democracy, opposition today can become government tomorrow. But there is another thing, which is basically that disinformation doesn't necessarily want you to believe in something different from the reality. That, of course, might be a maximum goal. But the minimum goal is that it wants to create doubts. It wants you not to be able to distinguish real and unreal. Doubting is enough, because then again, you really don't know what are your reference points. And the big problem with disinformation is that it's much more dangerous in a democratic societies, because in a democratic society, we have an open space for information, which basically means that disinformation can easily find loopholes where it can basically smuggle into normal and legitimate information. Now, let me bring you to a trip to Estonia. If I may ask you a honest question, no worries, we don't get upset by that. How many of you could locate Estonia in the map? Whoa, that's a satisfactory number. Okay, it grows. Very good, very good. Yeah. Now, I hope that by the end of today's chat, you will be more able to locate Estonia in the map. So, to give you a couple of data about the country, Estonia is a huge country. We have 1,300,000 inhabitants. Estonia, after being occupied by the Soviet Union for more than 40 years, it regained independence in 1991 after a long Soviet occupation. And it's home to a large Russian-speaking minority, which to some extent descends out of the Soviet occupation. Estonia joined in 2004 EU and NATO. By the way, about the Russian-speaking minority, Miley will tell you a bit more in a bit. And if you look at the map, you will basically see our very large neighbor to the east. That's Russia. Just to give you an example, Russia has 100 times more the population of Estonia, and as you might know, is the largest country in the world in terms of extension. After having lost its Soviet empire, Russia has been the main source of disinformation and malicious interference for Estonia. And very often that disinformation has been propelled through Kremlin-controlled medias that have been playing with history, memory, and even the legitimacy of Estonia as a state. Again, this has brought quite a fair amount of fake news and disinformation to Estonia, and the main target has been the Russian-speaking population. Now, I give you a couple of examples about how disinformation cannot be simply troubling, problematic, but also to some extent, it can even have very dangerous impact of people's lives. I bring you back to the COVID times, which I'm sure many of you remember with great joy. Now, during COVID time, Russia's state-controlled medias started to pump the following narratives, that the Russian-produced vaccine, Sputnik, which was not allowed in the EU, was the best vaccine to address COVID. On the other hand, it started to spread quite a lot of disinformation about the Western-produced vaccines. So the idea was to create suspicion, as I said. The idea was to create sort of uncertainty. Shall I take it or shall I not? Now, you see two maps here. The map up shows you the distribution of Russian-speaking population in Estonia, which is more likely to consume Russian-speaking medias. The darker is the color in the map, the more Russian speakers you find. And below, you find the map of the percentage of vaccinated population in Estonia. You will basically see that among the Russian speakers, vaccination was much less likely than among Estonian speakers. And you will also find out that if you look at the death by COVID, Russian speakers were more likely to die than Estonian speakers by COVID. Now, what tool can be used in order to counter that? Again, we saw that, again, media's interference, so in this case we are talking about Kremlin-controlled medias, state medias that are watched and consumed, let's say, in our context. They spread disinformation, they are a vector of interference, they specifically target minorities, and undermine the societal cohesion. So, of course, ban is one option. To some extent, it was operated even before the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But I would say that the best idea that Estonia has come up with, and this happened already in the, after Russia's invasion of Crimea and war in eastern Ukraine, has been to create a domestic alternative. Estonia has created one TV channel. It's a public TV channel in Russian language. It provides a domestic alternative to externally brought disinformation. It has basically a decimal of the budget, of course, of Russian state TV, but it is able, unlike the Russian TV, to focus on the local dimension, to tell people stories, to go to towns and interview local businesses and so on. It's the idea of involving community. And the other thing is that it doesn't simply copy and paste news from the Estonian language medias, but it develops it soon. So it's a good way to kind of, create a locally developed narrative vis-a-vis the foreign ones. The last story I want to tell you, it's about this lady. Any of you knows this lady? Oh, you know that lady? That's good, at least one. I also know that lady. Yes. Huh? No, not personally, as a friend. But, so this lady is the former Prime Minister of Estonia, and for you to know, is highly likely to be the next EU foreign policy chief, a high representative of the EU for common foreign and security policy. And she has been recently at the center of a quite heavy disinformation campaign. You see that picture, which is replicated pretty much in all of these pages. Well, basically, it was shared by Kremlin-controlled accounts in X, then Twitter, and other social medias, a day after her candidature as High Representative of EU Foreign Policy Chief, and widely shared in different medias, primarily Kremlin-controlled. It represents Kaja Kallas, that's her name, when she was young, with her family. And basically, the narrative goes along these lines. Well, look, she hates Russia so much. She's so opposed to Russia, but see how happy she was in Soviet time. How much privilege she had, that rich, let's say, furniture and, somehow that surrounding. So basically a story of privilege and hypocrisy. Now, there are a couple of points that really don't match with that. The first one is simply that picture was taken a few years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So it clearly does not tell us a Soviet story. The second one is that the family furniture dates back from the 20s when Estonia still was not occupied. And let's say, just as a minor point, let's say, to debunk this story, Kaja Kallas' grandparents were deported by the Soviets and sent to Siberia. But despite, let's say, this very easily debunking of this story, well, this became very popular among Russian trolls, and even after debunked, kept living in its own story. There you can see basically different editions of Pravda in different languages, in which basically the story was even translated by AI, so not even an individual was behind there. Last minute that I want to take, that I want to spend with you is like, a couple of solutions that might be interesting and that, somehow Estonia can share with other countries. And here are a couple of ideas. The first one is, let's say, when comments are posted in medias, newspapers primarily, very often authentication is required. It's not about self-censorship, but it's about that I should know who writes something. Another thing, it's something that I try to find the best way to define that. I didn't want to use the term web police or internet police because that might sound a bit intimidating. But basically, it's that in every county in Estonia, there is one police contact that can help you to feel safe in the web. If you face harassment through the web, if you basically, let's say, experience disinformation, if basically something happens through the internet, you can get in touch even in Facebook, social medias, with that person who is a member of the police force and then can help you. We study and we introduce cyber hygiene from schools, and that is something that, as Cécile and Virginie said, can really help to kind of, develop these antibodies against disinformation. There are very good tools of fact-checking, which are quite accepted at population level. This one that you see there, Propa Stop, basically it's quite popular, and I think is not washing powder, as Miley said, but the big plus, and the motto there is like, the ideal tool to wash propaganda away from Estonia. And the last thing is basically that we have been scaling up ideas and sharing practices. Estonia hosts the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence. So the idea is that we share their ideas, and also we have, let's say, networks of medias that are reliable from different EU countries that exchange ideas and exchange basically best practices. I think I stop here. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Stefano, for this also journey through your presentation, and also giving these practical examples. And I actually wanted to pick on your last points of best practices and lessons. As you mentioned, Estonia is a small country, but again, due to our geopolitical proximity to our neighbor, Estonia also has quite an extensive experience in both when it comes to cyber attacks, but also countering disinformation. And maybe if you could, at the end of our panel discussion, could elaborate a little bit more on these lessons learned, how these examples and good practices could be also used maybe in other member states, including France, and especially now in light of geopolitical developments and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine and Russia's role in it. Now I would like to turn to Miley and to give her also the floor to continue with the case studies.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I will continue basically where Stefano left off and say a few more words about disinformation, but perhaps with a bit more focus on the issue of minorities. While I will speak from the point of view of Estonia and mostly the Russian-speaking minority, then I'm sure that all of you here can also think of an example from France, or if you have a different home country, what could be a similar situation and how it might be applicable in your case as well. So first of all, let's, and this is maybe the most detailed slide, I promise the rest are pictures. Then maybe let's think all of us a little bit, what does it mean that minorities might be more vulnerable to disinformation than regular citizens? This is a list. I put here 8 specific points, but actually the list can be much longer. You can maybe think of issues from your own experience. You can always add things to this list. But let's quickly check these items. So first of all, the very obvious issue, a language barrier. Of course, all people who live in a country must obviously speak the languages of this country, but sometimes, and in the case of minorities, the official language of the country might not be your mother tongue, right? So the extent to which you are able to speak this language may also limit your access to accurate information. Because you might be inclined to search for information in your native language, but if it's not the official language of the country, then you might struggle to find this accurate information about things which are going on, you know, in your city, in your county, in your country where you are. So a language barrier is definitely one of the key issues, and in a way, all other points start coming from there, right? So we already discussed the issue of media. If you do not speak the language very well, or you prefer to follow news in a different language, then you might end up using alternative sources and pay less attention to mainstream media. I mean, most of all, we speak about social media. As far as I understand, nowadays, people less and less read newspapers, follow official TV. We all get information updates from social media, different accounts. These are from people who share news. These are the people who we trust, who we follow, but they might not be mainstream media, and they might not be sharing mainstream media sources. There are certain rules and regulations in place which media, if they want to present accurate information, how they must write the news, how they must share this information. So it's important to also consider what kind of sources are used. Social media I already mentioned, but perhaps from the point of view of minorities in particular, we can think of community-centric issues or community-centric groups, which might not also be in the official language. So again, information in, I don't know, Facebook groups, other types of places. Somebody writes something, oh, I saw outside this car, it was really suspicious. I think there are some dangerous men going around, you know. This is very hard to verify, this type of information. I think I have to speed up, right? So limited fact-checking initiatives, or fact-checking is getting more and more common in almost all countries, but usually it also happens in the official language. So it might not be available in minority languages, and this can be a big problem. Then the fifth point I have here, and maybe we can deal with it together with the sixth point, socioeconomic disparities and political marginalization. If you are, studies show that in the case that minorities are often in a more vulnerable position, also socioeconomically, they might have less access to let's say, very good employment opportunities, maybe also because they don't speak the language, or due to, you know, the region that they live in or something similar. So a certain socioeconomic differentiation occurs in the society, and which in turn can lead to this political marginalization, that there aren't really political representation for these particular groups, and also the minority groups feel that their opinion is not taken into account. So you can see how this issue starts to snowball from maybe not knowing the language too well to all kinds of other potential risks. And now we come already to the very specific issues where minorities might become targeted. There you see a lots of opportunities where you can, if somebody wants to, can deliberately target these particular groups to spread disinformation. And as we spoke already here, it doesn't have to be that it's completely false news, right? It can be very different levels. It can take into account things which are real, but just present them from a different perspective. And I have two pictures here. Of course, they are very small on the screen, but just two things which I wanted to show you from to make you think in a more general context before I also share something in the Estonian context. So you can see the image on the left here. Everybody knows who is on the picture, right? But below the picture, there is a thread of conversation. Somebody asks, is this photoshopped? The person responds, no. The conversation goes longer, that Taylor Swift basically flew to Africa to take this photo, where she eats ice cream in front of hungry, poor black kids. So if we think back now, what we talked in the beginning about the distinction between misinformation and disinformation, then this photo with Taylor Swift can easily, I mean, we can say that it doesn't have to have like a deliberate intent to cause harm. Yes, of course, it might do something to her image, but you know, it might not be such. You know, it doesn't need to be harmful. However, if you think now in terms of minorities, then this is a very good example how to basically stir up racism, how to stir up these concerns, and how to create this distrust in the society. So on the one hand, it's a stupid picture, even maybe really poorly photoshopped, but on the other hand, you can see that it can have actually serious roots. And we talked about COVID, but just wanted to show this photo here. The photo says that this is Italy because everybody has COVID. People don't fit in the hospitals anymore, so they have to be on the street. So this is what the title said. What it actually, now there are sick people on the street, but the photo is actually from Croatia, from earlier times, due to an earthquake where people could not be indoors in the hospitals, so they had to be on the street. So you see, there is something true, but in the appropriate context, you know, you can tie it with all kinds of things. Okay, and now I will quickly jump over some of the things which I maybe otherwise would have said, and say a little bit about the Estonian context, which I also wanted to discuss and give you a few examples. So we talked about Russian propaganda in the case of Estonia. So here is one example, and I purposefully took an example which is older. It's from 2017. And the story is the following. So somebody, an Estonian woman, wrote to the authorities saying that, so true story, yeah? Estonian woman wrote to the authorities saying that, that they need to do a better job to protect Estonian cultural heritage, and perhaps we should consider how cemeteries are used. This was picked up by Russian media, who interpreted it in such a way, saying that Estonians don't want to be buried in the same cemeteries together with Russians, that it is forbidden to bury Russians. Now, it might seem ridiculous, but if you are a Russian speaker in a particular region and you do not speak Estonian and you cannot follow the context, this immediately causes, it really fuels this hatred between different groups. And with various news, with various different attempts, as also discussed by Stefano, there is a continuous stream which slowly but carefully continues to basically to reinforce this impression. And the more distrust you have between communities, the bigger is the chance that this information can actually spread. I think I have to stop here. So thank you very much. And then
Yeah, thank you, Miley. And we can always go back to some of the statistics that you wanted to show during our Q&A session, but I maybe also already pre-outlined the question that I would like to ask you. So if in case of Stefano, I wanted him to a bit more generalize and talk about how this could be applied in broader context, maybe if you could, Miley, also share what are specific distinctive features of disinformation in Estonian context, and also again bearing in mind Russian-speaking minority. So while our speakers maybe are thinking about the questions, and I can again repeat them. So to Cecile, I asked about the implications of kind of confusing the terms about misinformation and disinformation, and what are the implications. Virginie, I asked you about how the tools such as AI could whether help us to combat the disinformation or not. Well, Stefano, I already mentioned about some of the lessons learned and mighty distinctive features of disinformation in Estonia. So while you're thinking and cooking up your answers to these questions, I would like to then turn to our students who also worked quite hard this summer on analyzing the cases. And we have here representatives of two groups that did a very good job. I mean, everyone actually did a very good job, but they did extra good job. And I will just give you the floor. Please feel free to introduce yourself and your project, maybe in up to max 3 minutes. So I think we have microphones. I don't know if this microphone will also work. Yeah, or you can also stand up and, yeah, please.
Hello everyone, bonjour. I'm Anna Homasoridze, from representative of the University of Tartu, and I'm here to present the experience I got from the project. And the title of my project was Misinterpretation of the NATO through Russia, obviously. And our aim was to focus on the Russia and Baltic region, the Russian-speaking community, and we analyzed the public Facebook groups and analyzed the similarities of the narratives Russia shares in these communities. And generally, the aim of the similarities was to increase the distrust and polarize the communities. And one of the key highlights is that to represent NATO as an aggressive organization, and to NATO and saying that NATO encircles Russia and deploys the military forces around the borderline. Also, they are also using historical narratives and linking this negative disinformation to the NATO to foster their arguments that NATO is an aggressor, and also saying that NATO is not holding its promises to not expand. So all of this actually really impacts the community, and actually the recipe of the disinformation on both regions are the similar. And we found really important highlight in the group chat, Facebook group chat, that they are claiming and recognizing themselves as a compatriots, especially in Baltic region. And all of this mechanism is used to polarize people and change their perceptions and behavior at the end. And then at the end, we just understood the importance of countering disinformation in these regions and the mechanisms of it. So I think this is a brief intro of what I did, and we're really glad to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna. Thank you so much. So please, if you want, you can also speak French.
Hello, everyone. My name is Joris Poor. I am from France, but I was a student during that time at the University of Tartu in Estonia. And together with Alice Nadeau and Léonie Delahoutre, we worked on the same project, but our topic was Russian disinformation in the context of the war in Ukraine. Now, if you guys prefer, I can speak in French as well. Donc nous avons travaillé sur, dans le contexte, sur le contexte de
So
la
we worked on the context of disinformation, Russian disinformation as part of the war in Ukraine. And what we discovered, our main results, were that France and Estonia, even though these two countries are united
un membership commun de l'Union européenne
through being both members of NATO and the EU, both have different experiences when it comes to disinformation,
avec la désinformation, mais aussi la Russie et les relations qu'elles ont
but also in terms of their relationships with Russia. Estonia, despite its size is used to disinformation because they've been confronted to disinformation for a long time, and their independence dates back from the 90s, which is quite recent. And very quickly they had to adapt to a new dynamic with their neighbor to the east. So in response to that, there was a specialization of Estonia in the areas of fighting against disinformation, especially fighting against online cyber attacks, online attacks, etc., and similar things. Now, in France, we don't really have such experience, and we've always had, let's say, cordial, sometimes cold relationship with a kind of a mutual respect with Russia in France, which means that we were often, or more often, a victim of Russian disinformation, which we did not consider as a real threat at the time, but now means that we are a bit weaker when it comes to Russian attacks. So what we can learn from Estonia, despite the fact that it is a smaller country, at least in size, of less importance, in brackets, of a less importance on the international scene, if we can say that, is that we can learn from them and introduce this aspect in popular education, this fight against misinformation, how to educate young people, how to take information on the internet, how to be critical when it comes to the information that is related through internet, or relayed through internet. This is a long-term battle. We can't do that in a few years or in a few months. This will take maybe 10 years or more to make sure that future generations will be educated in that respect. However, what we can do, and we could say, is to have an intergovernmental relationship, collaboration with panel of experts who can meet and share and take advantage of the various frameworks put in place by the EU and also by NATO to allow experts, diplomats, high officials with responsibilities in the states to meet and learn one from another. Another important thing in the long term would be to look at the disinformation issues and how to counter disinformation as being depoliticized areas, so removing political battles from the issue of disinformation. This is, according to what we have seen, what we have researched, would help having a better understanding of disinformation, especially in the context of the war in Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Our students, indeed, they did very good, incredible job. And it's, I think, also very nice student to lecture collaboration here as well. So I want to maybe give one round of giving you brief answers to these questions, and then we still have time to take questions from you. So please feel free to also ask your questions. So I will start with Cécile, maybe to kind of elaborate a little bit about the question that I posed. So what are the dangers and implications of confusing disinformation from misinformation? And if you could elaborate a little bit on that. Okay, I mean, maybe then I could move on to...
Désolée.
Okay. Sorry, I wasn't actually following. I was elsewhere. Can you hear me? Okay, good. So what are the risks, the impact, the consequences of disinformation, misinformation? I think Stefano already spoke about that. The risks are to try to harm to people,
On peut reprendre le terrain de l'Ukraine.
If we look at Ukraine again and Estonia and
On
Russia,
voit bien que là, il y a des attaques pour
we can see that there are
fissurer les communautés.
attacks to try to divide communities
Lien dans la société, la démocratie. Donc
and
voilà,
democracy. That's one of the risks.
Stefano, il a dit à un moment,
Stefano
enfin,
also mentioned, this was on the
peut tuer.
slide, that
Alors, évidemment,
disinformation
ça peut
can
être
actually
peut-être une
kill.
formule un peu,
That might seem
mais effectivement,
violent
ça
and
peut
strong,
tuer.
but
Moi,
yes,
je
indeed,
reprends des
it can
exemples. Moi,
kill.
j'ai travaillé sur
I'm
la
just using a number of
désinformation.
examples.
Alors,
I've been working on
une
disinformation for a long
formation
time. I'm a
de
journalist by
je connais bien les
by
métiers de la presse.
training. I'm familiar with the media businesses, and I don't deny what media do, but I try to understand what they do. But in what Stefano was saying when he said, that disinformation can kill, which could seem violent, but try to put yourself in the context of the COVID pandemic. We had a lot of disinformation back then, especially at the very start of the pandemic in the year 2020. Again, looking back to the example of the US, because they have a lot of disinformation, especially these days with Donald Trump. But there was a lot of disinformation back then that said that in order to kill the virus, you had to drink bleach. It might seem a bit crazy, but there were people who did that. There were people who did drink bleach. I think one people died and others were sick. So this could have some terrible consequences on the body, on the health, on the mind as well. We talk about the mind and any impact also on health. So many risks. I'm not going to mention all the risks, but the point here is to try to divide communities. Also, the reputation of someone. Talking about Donald Trump again, he publishes a lot of disinformation. He attacked the adverse camp, Kamala Harris, the opposite camp. He also attacked Hillary Clinton. I don't know if you heard about the Pizzagate back then. This was disinformation, of substantial disinformation, actually. They used to say that there was a pizzeria in an American place where in the basement of that pizzeria there were some pedophiles clubs. This was all conspiracy organized against Hillary Clinton. Now, this disinformation was something that stayed with her forever. So there was an attempt also to harm the personality, what the person represents. So there is a denial and an attack on the actual person, be it on their physical appearance, on their mind, on their spirit, etc. So disinformation can have a lot of risks. I'm not going to give all these lists, but on this expression of killing, because yes, we are in an information warfare. I think in France, maybe we're not so aware of this, but Estonia has understood now for a long time that this is the case. In France, I don't think we have understood that there was a warfare of information. We have not understood that in France we too are attacked by Russia. President Macron has been under attack from Russia. All the Israel-Palestinian communities, again, you can see that people have been trying to divide these communities and oppose these communities. So we no longer are in the living together. The Declaration of Human Rights, 1789. France is a country that defends human rights, and as you can see, we are being attacked in our good living together in peace. So we are being threatened in our country. It's no longer a war on the field, but continuously France is being attacked by disinformation, mainly orchestrated by Russian people.
Thank you, Cécile. I will then give everyone a chance to answer, and also feel free to briefly reflect if you want to comment on each other's interventions. So, but let's try to be brief so we also can take some questions from audience. So please, Virginie.
Alors, pour répondre à la question de
Now, coming back to the use of AI or the threat of AI in this information warfare, two things to mention here which are important. Firstly, the word AI should be changed. That's the first thing. What computers are able to produce today has nothing to do with intelligence, the intelligence decisions that we have in our minds.
Aujourd'hui, les ordinateurs ne peuvent que
Computers today can only reproduce,
vraiment, c'est-à-dire
literally copy and paste and reproduce what
ils arrivent à
they are
comprendre, entre guillemets,
able to
de ce qu'est
understand
l'humour, de ce qu'est
from what is maybe a
une
desire, an
émotion, de ce
emotion,
qu'est une idée
humor,
politique,
what is a
etc.
political idea,
Mais
etc.
on est bien loin de ce
But we
qu'un
are
être humain
far
est capable
from
de
what a
produire en
human being
termes
is
de
able to
processus
produce in
intellectuels.
terms of intellectual
Donc, c'est la raison
process,
pour laquelle je
which is the
pense
reason
qu'il
why I
faut
think
davantage les considérer
we
comme
should
étant des
consider
aides à la
AI as being
décision,
rather
sur
an
des
aid
tâches,
to decision
automatiques,
making
répétitives,
on repetitive or
de
automatic
synthèse,
tasks
etc., où
of
ils sont
synthesis,
effectivement très efficaces en
where they
termes
can
de
be
gain de
indeed
temps.
very efficient in terms
on
of
n'a pas encore
helping
arrivé
us
au
to
moment
gain
où,
time, but we
la
haven't come
machine,
yet to the
va,
point when
prendre l'ascendant
the
sur,
machine will
sur
take
l'homme.
over mankind.
Grâce à ce qu'on a dans la tête, notre
Thanks to
cerveau, qui est
what
quand
we
même
have
une
in our
machine
brain,
assez,
which is
surpuissante,
a
hein. Je
super
pense que, en
powerful
tant que psychologue,
machine. I think
on
as
est bien
a
placé pour,
psychologist,
savoir
we
que,
know this
cet
fairly
esprit
well.
critique, on peut le
This
cultiver
critical mindset can
par
be
l'éducation
cultivated,
avant
can
tout.
be
Je
developed
crois en
through
l'éducation.
education. I strongly
De
believe
vous,
in
les jeunes,
education.
votre génération
Your
et celle qui va
generation
suivre
and the
va être
following
celle
generations
qui,
will
vont
be
prendre les
the
décisions
generation
politiques à
that will
venir.
make the political
Et donc,
decisions in the
c'est sur
future.
vous, en fait, qu'il faut qu'on
Therefore,
mise et
we need
développer
to
votre esprit
aim
critique,
at
votre
your
éducation aux médias et à
education, help
l'information,
you develop your critical
par
thinking
des entraînements, des
through training,
sensibilisations,
through
des
raising
exercices
awareness, through
qui
various
vous permettent,
exercises that will
d'affûter
enable
vos
you to
connaissances, mais aussi de
fine-tune your
développer ce qu'on
knowledge
appelle des
and also to
compétences,
develop what we
des compétences de
call
synthèse, des
skills,
compétences de
skills,
prise de décision,
competences
des
when it comes to
compétences
decision
d'évaluation
making,
de
to
l'information.
assessing
Et
information,
peut-être le plus important,
and maybe what's more
d'avoir
important
ce qu'on appelle la
is to be able to
métacognition,
have what we call the
c'est-à-dire
metacognition,
être capable de
meaning
penser
being
sur ses
able to
propres
think
processus de pensée.
with
C'est-à-dire
your own thinking
se
processes,
regarder dans un miroir et
meaning
dire,
being able to
moi, en
look
fait,
at
cette
yourself
information,
in
elle
a
me plaît
mirror
bien,
to
et
say,
j'ai
okay,
envie
I
d'y
like
croire.
this information, I
Du
want
coup,
to
est-ce que
believe
c'est
in this
bien de
information.
réfléchir comme
Now,
ça?
is this good to
Est-ce
think
que
that
j'en
way?
sais suffisamment
Do I know
sur ces points?
enough
Est-ce que,
sufficiently about these
je
items,
devrais
these
pas
points?
davantage
Should I
réfléchir
not
avant de
rather
décider?
think
Pourquoi? Parce qu'en
more
fait,
before
et
I
c'est
make a
peut-être l'idée la plus
decision?
importante à
And this
garder
might be
aussi
the
de
most
ce qu'on a-
important
de ce que j'ai
idea
évoqué
and
tout à
to
l'heure, c'est
remember
que
and take
quand
away
une
from what I've been
information, elle
saying.
rentre dans notre
When an
système de
information
pensée,
gets into our
d'une
thinking
manière ou d'une
system
autre,
in one
elle
way or
l'influence.
another, it will influence it.
Implicitement, inconsciemment,
Unconsciously
ou
or
bien
implicitly or directly.
Mais une information
But
qui
an
rentre
information that
est
comes
une
in
information qui
is an
modifie la
information
structure
that
de
will
nos pensées pour
modify
la
the
suite,
structure
en
of
fait.
our
Donc
mindset and
savoir
our
se
thoughts
prémunir de
thoughts
la
pattern for the
désinformation, de
future.
la
So being able
mésinformation,
to prevent
et pas
yourself from
seulement la
misinformation and
corriger
disinformation, but not only simply correct
la transformer,
misinformation or
c'est vraiment
disinformation
le
and transform
premier barrage,
that is actually the
c'est-à-dire,
first
stop,
barrier, the first
j'arrête
obstacle.
d'aller sur
I
tel
would say,
réseau
okay,
parce que je
stop,
sais,
I
par
will
exemple,
stop
que sur
looking
tel
at this
réseau, je suis
network, at
exposée
this
à
media,
tel
because
type
I know that if I
d'information
continue,
qui
I
vient
might be
ensuite
exposed
changer
to a
de
type of
manière
information
pernicieuse
that
ma
might
façon
change
globale de
my
penser.
way, my global way of thinking.
Thank you so much, Virginie. So,
Yes, I'll be as fast as possible. Much was already said. Well, I think that how Estonian example can be helpful. Well, I think first of all, we should understand that this is a challenge which is shared by democracies. We are all in the same boat. Autocrats in general, and here we're not talking about Putin's Russia only, are afraid of democracies that work. Because if democracies work, one day their citizens might say, hey, look, why can't we have democracy as well? So for autocrats, it's very important that, democracy fails. Estonia is a small country, 1,300,000 inhabitants, but doesn't mean that, let's say, the examples, or at least the best practices cannot be scaled up. You might say, well, size matters. Yes, it does, but generally larger countries have more resources, which basically means that they can invest more money than a small country invests to do the same things on a larger scale. So I think this is a good point. Other couple of points that I think matters is like, we can have the most sophisticated tools, the best attempts to counter disinformation and to create a relatively clean media space and so on. But I think for this we need two important requirements which are at the top. The first one is that institutions should be trusted overall, meaning that, let's say, the institutions that should connect citizens to politics should be overall a common ground where every citizen somehow can recognize. And the second one is that elites, so the ones who rule on top, might debate and discuss on issues and policies, but should agree on what disinformation is and how to counter it. So they shouldn't take disinformation on board for political advantage. And maybe the last two thoughts. The first one is about the technological tools. I mean, I very much agree when it comes to how to define AI, but I think overall we should be aware that, yes, Estonia can share quite a lot about digitalization, digital technologies, and so on. Estonia is supposed to be the first e-state in the world, but beyond that, we should also be aware that technology didn't really change the goals of disinformation, making us believe things that are not real and spreading distrust among citizens. These are there from the time of Ramesses to now. Basically, what technology has changed is simply the tools that are used to do that. And the last thing is awareness. I think if one thing Estonia can be useful to, let's say, other European, or let's say not only European countries, that, as it was mentioned, maybe because of the challenges that we have faced in terms of history, but also in recent history, we are a bit more aware of what could be the potential threats to our democracy and the potential threats to our open societies. And I stop here.
Thank you so much. Maile.
Yeah, thank you. And I will use this opportunity here to go back to one of my slides very cleverly to just, because this topic about what are the distinctive features of disinformation in the Estonian context and in the case of minorities in Estonia, then I just want to show you this graph, which shows the support for NATO, Estonia's NATO membership in the past 2 years. The first, you don't even need to see the numbers, but you can see the above row and the below row, and you see that there is a significant difference. The above is somewhere around 90%, and the below one is somewhere close to 50, but below 50. Now, support to NATO among Estonians is the one above, and support for NATO Estonia's NATO membership among other nationalities living in Estonia is the one below. And this talks to the student presentations very well. It talks to what we have been discussing here very well, that it is very, one key element of disinformation is to create distrust. And you can see in the graph here that this distrust has been created, or it has always been, but the gap is maybe narrowing, but very slowly. So opinion polls like that can actually help us understand where the different views lie, and also then what can be done to bring society more together. So I think I'll just stop here. I would have so much more to say, but let's take some questions.
Thank you so much. I now want to open the floor for the audience. You can ask in French, of course, and maybe there are some questions to our speakers. I think we have some microphones also in the audience. Yes, please. Mm-hmm.
Hello everyone. First, I'd like to start by thanking you from deep down in my heart, because we came from Paris with a group of young people, two groups, one who is in another workshop. I'm a director for youth, but I've been engaged for a long time around living together issues. I have come here with something that I can call pessimistic on these issues, because it's from what I hear. And I'm very happy with the last intervention, what you said, because the most important for youth is the upskilling. This upskilling to try to decipher what is happening in our world and aspire to have to be able to be amongst decision makers, because when you're like me, you work in education, pedagogy, teaching, you convey values to young people, values that are positive, living together. We need to also prepare them to a world that is not so nice, and you need to support them. Sometimes we fall into the trap of misinformation, and I'd like to thank you for this image you gave of this woman artist with the ice cream. I come from Morocco myself, and I'm next to a city. The airport is Ebno Batuta. It's very well known. It's one of the first people who went around the world, traveled around the world, and I read that it's not Christopher Columbus. He was the one to discover the Americas. So I believed it, but it's, well, in this case, it's...
Ah, d'accord.
Sorry.
Pardon.
Sorry, apparently.
Désolé. Parce que j'ai parlé vite, alors...
I was speaking too fast for the interpreter, but no, it's fine, really.
Je dis, on est un petit peu patient quand on fait ce métier.
We're patient. We need to be patient, and I'm sorry to speak in this way because I'm delighted. I'm also sad seeing the world we are evolving in. There's so many questions. When you say, because I really love this toolbox, the Zitetics, I loved your toolbox, and for any topic, if we could look into this toolbox to support people and young people as well, I think we can manage to find something that will come from their own thought, and maybe it's not too late, but decision makers have reached their objective. This is what is more scary to me. The massacre of Okati, for those who know it, for many years it was taught in Polish and Russian schools, and even outside of them, that was a massacre committed by Nazis when it was committed by Russians. So what can we do when disinformation is wanted by editorialists who work with people who play an important role in the economic world? And what can we do where we stand when we support these young people on these stories? And we want to say that peace is about living together, respecting others. If there's somebody amongst the panel that talked about minorities, we have 130 nationalities and minorities in France that live here, and we must tell them that France is about meeting people, loving one another. You are all the France of the future. Thank you very much.
So, should we maybe take at least one more question and then we... Yeah. Are there any other questions? Yes, I think, please. Maybe we take a round of...
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for your intervention. I had a question because you talked about all the ways and means that Estonia put in place so that they could avoid miscommunication, misinterpretation and everything. For how long has it been put in place in Estonia? Because in France, we don't have much things to avoid these mistakes. So for how long has it been put in place in Estonia?
Okay, thank you for the question. So maybe we can then take these two questions and very briefly elaborate on them. And if we have time, we can also take a couple more.
Je suis pas certaine de partager
So
votre
I'm not sure I share your pessimistic opinion on the situation and the world in which our young people are evolving today. I'm maybe too optimistic, but in France, in any case, and this is possibly true for other countries in Europe, in the United States, and elsewhere, we have a quality of life that has nothing to do with our ancestors who lived, let's say, 70 or 100 years ago. I think that things have evolved and are going in the right direction. So I'm holding on tightly to this to say that today is better than yesterday in many aspects. But the evolution means that we have new threats to which we need to adjust and adapt. And education is one of the levers on which we can count and find support to adapt. There's the question of the quickness to which we need to adapt today. But in any case, it's daily. We need to also give our young people the possibility to be actors of their learnings, what they learn, sharing values that are those of the world in which they want to live in the future. Thus, we need to put them back in the center of the decision making made by our governments, because if there's a negative aspect in our societies today, we let youth in the back too much, and we need to empower them because they have responsibilities. When you're an educator, when you're a teacher, I have students, I try to convey knowledge to help them save time, and I tell them the objective I have to do so, and then I help them, and they, with their motivation, with their emotions, they are the actors of their own skills development. If they want, and they're upskilling. If they have an objective, I try to help them define it, and these professional objectives, what I want to do as an expert in the future to act upon the world I want to live in. I'm going to answer because I think that it was wonderful. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming from Aubervilliers. You talked indeed about young people and skills or competences. In the beginning of my speech, I talked about informational context. I'd like to remind you that we have intermediaries that inform us, journalists, written press, radio, television, etc. And indeed, everything has been mixed since the appearance of social media, Facebook, and it's true, with the web and blogs, we have become, well, we are receiving, but we are sending. Everything is mixed up. And as citizens, as readers, as auditors, we need to sort things. And with the new technologies, what is highlighted is the speed. We are drowned. I talked about infobesity. We are drowned under massive information, and this is what happens for you. Sometimes we don't know who wrote the news. Is it a journalist, my mother, my grandmother, the next door neighbor, my friend? We're totally lost. So there is a competence, but we have mentioned it slightly. I think Stefano talked about fact-checking. I think you said that. So indeed, there are journalists that work, and they do what we call fact-checking. We check information, also an important aspect, and we haven't mentioned it yet. It is essential before having an information, if it's wrong, true, whatever, ask yourself the question, is it necessary to relay this information? Is it necessary to disseminate it? There's a viral pandemic, and we, as a relay at a given moment, we can say, stop, I will not relay this information. We need, because in fact, finding the traps, it's not always easy. Sometimes we can hesitate, and at a given time, when you don't know, do not disseminate, do not relay, do not like anything. We must also do this work and say stop. We need to stop passing on information, whether it's true or false. Is it important to relay information constantly? We need to also have a distance and have this critical mindset. AI, indeed, will completely, well, you can agree or not, but McCarthy in the 50s, we talked about AI because it was the copy of mankind, a copy of our brains. We can talk about it. I don't talk about AI. I talk about it in the plural. There are several intelligences, and this will be problematic with information. There are deep fakes. There are algorithms as well, etc., etc.
Thank you so much. Then I pass the ball to Stefano and Miley. Yeah?
Yes, just briefly. Well, first of all, thanks a lot to you. Because by bringing your students here, I think, again, this is already a good contribution to kind of, take over this challenge. I think, again, really knowledge, awareness, this is the first tool. This is the first antibody against disinformation. I would say, to your question, is it too late? No, it's not too late, but for sure it's urgent. And I think that in a way, one thing that is important, especially when we talk about a diverse society, is to understand that really, let's say, what disinformation wants us to believe is that we have many more differences than things in common. Well, in fact, it's exactly the opposite. And it's exactly the opposite because we are all targets of disinformation. Minorities, let's say, ruling elites, people in position of advantage, people in position of disadvantage, literally everyone. And since we are in a world of multiple identities, I think that the best message that we can get is that we are all minorities in our own ways. Now, about Estonia, for how long Estonia has been dealing with disinformation, I would say since at least it's regained its independence in 1991. I think that Estonia somehow saw the challenge of countering disinformation very much as something has to do with its own survival from the very beginning, because again, this idea of widening the differences, let's say, widening the gap in the society, creating a divided society was exactly the goal of this disinformation. I think that, of course, let's say, having tried to deal with that from the 90s, I think that much has been learned over the years. This doesn't mean that mistakes were not done. Of course, mistakes were done, but it's also a way to learn out of mistakes. And in a way, I think that really this perception of a direct threat was the main motive behind really taking initiative. And I think in a way this is a general message to every open society. Even if you don't see the threat is there. And maybe last point is that, of course, one aspect which has been particularly taken care of is the digital context. Estonia has very much grown as a complex digital society, and so in a way we had the luck, but also, of course, let's say, we were tested in developing tools in the digital context that were supposed to be resilient to disinformation, and I think that so far this has worked, but of course, as I said, challenge is there, was there, and will be there. So, thanks.
Okay, then I think we probably don't have time for last question, or maybe there's something very short.
Something very short?
Yes, maybe very briefly.
I have a question, a very short one, but I wanted to know, since the beginning you've been talking about AI as something that is negative, especially when it comes to information, and I understand it's a war of information, but I wondered, lately on Twitter, what we see are community notes, or a person can answer whether information is true or false, and I thought whether AI could serve in this way, could help us rather to know whether the information is true or false, because AI doesn't have this emotional aspect, thus the interest to answer true or false. I wanted to know whether AI could, in the near future, help us to solve this issue.
Thank you. Maybe very briefly. Yeah, Virginie.
Alors, pour vous répondre, l'intelligence artificielle,
to answer, AI can be a tool that helps to make decisions if we know how to ask it the right questions. If, for example, you ask AI to find the source of an information, yes, in this case, it is positive. It will do it more efficiently and maybe more quickly than you could, and without making mistakes, indeed. Except that if you are not there to know what you need to seek or look for, and you just say, is this information true or false? It will not ensure that the answer provided by AI is the right one. You need systematically, you as a person, or the operator, the agent, you need to be in control of what the AI does or executes. So in this framework, yes, AI is something that is positive for our civilization. I totally agree with Virginie. It can be helpful. On the other hand, when you say it's emotionless, for the moment, you know, we're going to adapt. I'm working. My two research themes are disinformation and social robotics. I observe robots. I see them. I see how we use them. We're only going to also going to detect emotions. We're going to adapt to us. So in the future, AI and conversational agents are aware of your emotions. If you're sad, they're going to send you content. Either they'll make you even sadder or happier. It all depends. Indeed, AI is going to adapt to emotions, and this needs to be taken into account. It's important. It can also help you detect fake information or false information. I remind you that you talk about negative information. What brings in the most click is what is negative. This is where people click more. There's a whole marketing aspect. Social media is not for free.
Okay,
we tend to forget it.
We don't have any more time for any questions, but I would like to thank you all for attention. I would like to thank our students and most importantly to thank our panelists. And thank you so much for your attention. Thank you.
On vous demande, merci, de bien nous ramener tous les casques en enroulant en fait le cordon, s'il vous plaît, déjà. Ça nous évitera voilà, de perdre un peu trop de temps à votre sortie, parce qu'il va y avoir un petit embouteillage. Merci à vous.
Thank you very much.